I thought grief would make the rooms smaller. Instead, it stretched time like a rubber band about to snap. The chapel smelled faintly of lilies and old wood, and every second the clock ticked above the door felt like a question I didn't know how to answer. My father lay quiet, the lines on his face finally resting, while my mother sat 2 pews ahead, spine straight, hands folded so tightly the knuckles whitened like stones in a river. People came to say the things people say. He was a good man, he loved you both, he's in a better place. I nodded because nodding is the language of the grieving. But my mother didn't nod. She barely blinked. She stared not at the casket, but somewhere past it, as if she were listening for a train only she could hear. When the pastor asked if anyone wanted to share a memory, I stood because I owed my father at least one. I talked about the summer he taught me to fix the porch steps, how he lined up the nails on the railing like a parade and said, "Measure twice, cut once. Regret lives in the inches you ignore." People smiled, then sighed. My mother didn't. Her jaw tightened the way it used to when the oven timer rang, and she'd already burned the roast. After the service, I caught her smoothing the inside of her wrist the way she does when she's hiding a tremor. That's when I noticed it. Her silver bracelet, the one she wore every anniversary, was missing a charm. It used to carry 3, my initial, my father's, and a tiny heart he bought the year he almost left his job but stayed for us. Now there were 2. I asked her quietly, "Did it fall?" She pulled her sleeve down and said, "It's fine." The way she says don't ask again. We drove to the burial site in a procession that felt like penance. I watched my mother through the rear-view mirror of the limo. Her eyes weren't red. They were alert, scanning, as if counting exits. When the casket lowered, she didn't cry. She pressed her fingertips to her lips and whispered something I couldn't hear. It wasn't goodbye. It sounded like "I'm sorry" said to someone who wasn't there. At the reception, the house filled with casserole dishes and condolences. My mother disappeared into her bedroom to rest and reemerged 15 minutes later with a face composed like a made bed. Guests hugged her. She hugged back, politely, precisely, then drifted toward my father's office and stood in the doorway, eyes on the desk where he kept his ledger, his letters, his quiet thoughts. She didn't step inside. When the last neighbor left, silence settled over the living room like dust. I started stacking plates. She started opening drawers. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "Nothing," she said, which in our home always meant something I don't want you to find. Her hands hovered over my father's wallet on the credenza, then moved past it, then returned, the way a sparrow schemes water before committing to land. She finally picked it up. Something metal clicked inside, small, deliberate. She slid whatever it was into her pocket, so quickly I almost believed I'd imagined it. "You should sleep," she said without meeting my eyes. "Tomorrow will be harder." I almost told her that harder than burying your husband sounded like a riddle, but I let it pass. Grief makes you charitable with other people's riddles. Later, when she was in the shower and the house steamed like a fogged mirror, I stood in the doorway of my father's office. The smell of cedar and paper. The chair still angled the way he left it after taxes last spring. On the desk, a ledger with a dog-eared page, a photograph of the 3 of us at the pier, and an envelope addressed in my father's careful hand, for when I'm gone. It wasn't sealed. Inside was a single line on a yellow note: "Measure twice, cut once." Check the pockets I never used. I felt the floor tilt. I went to his coat, brown wool, winter heavy, and slipped a hand into the inside pocket I'd never seen him touch. My fingers closed around a thin, cool shape, a key, brass and worn, tied with a red thread. On the tag, 2 letters in ballpoint ink. M.R. I stood there with the key and the red thread burning a line into my palm, and for the first time that day, I understood why my mother hadn't cried. Mourning can't begin when a second life is already knocking. And it was knocking from somewhere my father had measured twice and left for me to cut open. The morning after the funeral, the house smelled like rain and leftover grief. I woke to the sound of my mother moving dishes in the kitchen, not cooking, just moving them, like she wanted the clatter to drown out her thoughts. The coffee machine hissed, but the aroma didn't fill the air. It was weak, almost reluctant, like it knew it didn't belong in a house that had lost its heartbeat. She was still wearing black, but not the same dress. This one had pearls around the collar, subtle, proper, almost proud. I sat at the table, and she placed a cup in front of me without a word. When I said thank you, she gave a small nod, then sat opposite me and adjusted her sleeve. That's when I saw it again. The bracelet, now completely missing the heart charm. Only 2 initials dangled there. H for Henry, my father, and L for Linda, her. Mine was gone too. I tried to ignore it, but the absence was louder than the rain. Did it fall off? I asked. She looked down, pretended to notice it for the first time, and said, "Oh, maybe." Her eyes didn't follow her words. They looked past me, toward the window, where the glass was fogged and trembling with drops. "Strange," I said, "that both fell off." She smiled, that fragile, polite smile that mothers invent when they don't want to explain something. "Not everything that's lost needs to be found," she murmured. That sentence hung between us like a curtain. I almost asked what she meant, but her hand moved to cover the bracelet, and she changed the subject. "Your father loved this coffee. Said it tasted like Sundays." I nodded, but all I could think of was that missing heart, and how she'd said not everything needs to be found. It didn't sound like grief. It sounded like confession. After breakfast, I followed her to the laundry room under the pretext of helping. She took my father's clothes from the dryer and folded them with a precision that bordered on ritual. Every shirt, every pair of socks, folded, smoothed, stacked, sealed in a plastic bag. "You don't have to rush," I said. "We can do this later." She shook her head. "I need to clear the space." Then she whispered, "He hated clutter." But I remembered, my father was patient. He left half his books open, papers spread like breadcrumbs across his desk. He didn't mind clutter. He minded lies. When she stepped out to answer the phone, I glanced at the folded clothes. Something gleamed between the folds of a white shirt, a sliver of silver chain. I pulled it gently, and there it was, the missing heart charm. It was scratched, dulled by time, but engraved with 2 tiny initials I didn't recognize, not H or L. It read RG. I froze. RG. Who was RG? My father's initials were HRC. Mine were DC. I turned the charm over, hoping for an explanation, a date, anything, but it was blank on the back. Just those 2 letters. I slipped it into my pocket before she returned. My heartbeat was loud enough to drown out the dryer's hum. She came back holding the phone, her face pale. "It was the bank," she said. "They'll release your father's documents next week." Her voice trembled slightly, not from sadness, but from anticipation. I didn't ask what documents. I knew she wouldn't answer. That afternoon, while she napped, I sat in my father's office and laid the charm next to the key I'd found. RG and MR. 2 sets of letters, 2 clues, 1 silence. My father's note echoed in my mind. Check the pockets I never used. What if this wasn't the only pocket he meant? What if he wanted me to check the pockets of their marriage, the ones they both pretended were empty? As the rain thinned to mist, I looked out the window and saw my mother in the garden, kneeling by the hydrangeas she used to plant every spring. She was digging, not planting, her hands deep in the wet soil, face hidden by her hair. For a moment, I thought she was burying something. Then she stood up, brushed her hands on her dress, and walked back toward the house, lighter, relieved. I waited until she went inside, then stepped out into the garden. There, under the loosened soil, I found it. Another charm, identical to the first, but this one broken clean in half. 2 charms. 2 names. 2 lives. And for the first time I realized my mother wasn't just grieving a husband. She was covering a grave that didn't belong to him. I couldn't stop thinking about the key. I'd kept it hidden in my nightstand, inside a small wooden box my father once carved for me when I was a boy. Every night since the funeral, I opened that box just to stare at it, the brass worn from time, the red thread frayed at the ends, and those 2 initials, MR. It was the kind of key that looked too ordinary to hold meaning, yet too personal to be meaningless. One morning, As sunlight slipped through the blinds, I found myself in his office again. My mother had gone to the market, leaving me alone with the ghost of his scent, tobacco, cedar, and paper. I opened the top drawer of his desk, the one he always kept locked but had strangely left open before he died. Inside were only receipts, an old watch, and his wallet. I picked it up carefully, like it might still be alive with his warmth. The leather was cracked and soft from use. I opened it slowly, expecting to find nothing more than his driver's license and a few folded bills. But tucked behind a faded photograph of us, the three of us smiling at a lake I barely remembered, there was a folded note. My father's handwriting again, neat but rushed this time, as if written in the dark. If you found this, you're closer than you think. Don't trust the obvious. The truth wears a familiar face. I stared at the words until they blurred. Don't trust the obvious. The phrase pulsed in my head like a warning bell. Who was the familiar face? My mother? Someone else entirely? I turned the wallet upside down, and a small piece of folded paper fell to the floor, a receipt from a gas station 2 towns away, dated 3 weeks before he died. On the back of it, written in blue ink, was an address: Riverside Motel, room 12. I drove there that same afternoon. The sky was low and gray, the kind of weather that makes even your own thoughts echo. The motel looked forgotten, a row of rooms with peeling paint and doors that hadn't seen fresh locks in years. I parked across the street and waited, half expecting someone to come out and accuse me of trespassing on my father's secrets. When I finally walked up to room 12, the number on the door hung crooked, as if it too was tired of being part of the story. I tried the key. It didn't fit. My heart sank until I remembered the tag tied with the red thread. Maybe it wasn't for this place, but for what was inside it. I pushed the door. It wasn't locked. Dust filled the air, thick and untouched. On the dresser sat a small wooden box, identical to the one I'd kept my key in at home. I opened it, hands trembling. Inside, there was another note, this one unsigned. If she comes looking, tell her I forgave her long before I knew. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the springs groaning like they too carried secrets. My mother's bracelet flashed in my memory, the missing heart charm engraved with RG. Whoever RG was, my father had known. And now, maybe, so did she. That night, I returned home and found my mother sitting in the living room with the lights off, holding that same bracelet in her hands. She looked up at me, startled, then smiled faintly. Couldn't sleep? She asked. Her voice was calm, almost kind. But when I glanced down, I saw the faint red mark on her wrist, the same shade as the thread tied to my father's key. And for the first time, I wasn't sure who the key was meant to open, a door or a truth. For days, my mother barely spoke to me. We circled each other like strangers forced to share a roof. Every sound, a creaking floorboard, a closing drawer, seemed heavier, as if the house itself were eavesdropping. I couldn't shake the thought of that motel room or the message I'd found. My father's key lay hidden in my pocket like a pulse, reminding me there was still more to uncover. One morning, while organizing old family papers in the attic, I found a small folder labeled in my father's handwriting, Property Confidential. Inside were several documents, deeds, tax receipts, and a mortgage statement for an address I didn't recognize, 23 Maple Hill Road. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't the house we lived in. It wasn't even in our town. It was 3 hours away. I printed the address and drove there the next day, telling my mother I was visiting an old friend. The drive felt endless, filled with thoughts that raced faster than the car. The GPS led me down a winding road lined with trees still heavy from last night's rain. And then I saw it, a small white cottage with green shutters, flowers neatly trimmed, and a car parked in the driveway that looked familiar. My father's old car, the one my mother claimed he sold years ago. I parked down the street and watched. After a few minutes, the front door opened. A woman stepped out, mid-40s, auburn hair, delicate but tired eyes. She carried a basket of laundry and walked with a quiet confidence. A boy ran out behind her, laughing, calling, "Mom." She smiled, her voice soft, familiar. It was the kind of smile I hadn't seen on my mother's face in years. My heart pounded. The boy couldn't have been more than 12. My father had died 6 weeks ago. That boy had his eyes. The same gray-blue hue that never fully belonged to me or my mother. I couldn't breathe. I waited until they went back inside, then drove away with my chest burning like it was full of secrets I didn't ask to inherit. That night, back home, my mother was sitting in the living room again, the same bracelet gleaming faintly in the lamplight. "You look pale," she said, pouring herself tea. "Long drive." Her tone was casual, but her eyes were sharp. I froze. "How did you?" I stopped. She smiled faintly. "I may not know everything, but I always know when you've been somewhere you shouldn't." I didn't reply. I just stared at her, trying to read her silence. There was no denial in her face. Only exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying a lie for so long it becomes part of your posture. "Mom," I whispered, "how many houses did we have?" She looked down at her tea, then back at me. "Only one," she said. "But your father, sometimes, he needed another place to breathe." She stood up, her hand brushing the bracelet again. "And sometimes so did I." Then she walked toward the hallway and left me alone with the sound of her footsteps, steady, unapologetic, and echoing like a life built in halves. That night, I realized the house I grew up in might not have been our home at all, just the stage where one of her lives pretended to be whole. The next morning, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, already dressed as if waiting for a visitor. Her hair was perfectly brushed, makeup discreet, coffee untouched. The air smelled faintly of lavender, and something else, an unease that didn't belong to mornings. I sat down across from her, the wood between us feeling like a border. She broke the silence first. "You went to Maple Hill." It wasn't a question. It was a statement carved from calmness, the kind that hides panic underneath. I didn't ask how she knew. She always knew. I nodded slowly. "I saw them," I said. Her lips parted slightly, a tremor in her composure. "Then you know," she whispered, her voice a thread about to snap. "Who are they, Mom?" The question hung there, heavier than the steam rising from the untouched coffee. She stared out the window, watching the wind move through the hydrangeas. "They're no one," she said at last. "Just people your father helped." But her eyes told a different story, one too tired to keep pretending. "Helped how?" I pressed. She looked at me then, and for the first time, I saw fear, not of me, but of memory. "Your father was a good man," she began, the kind of sentence people use to justify what comes next. "He had responsibilities. Promises he made before you were born. I thought they'd ended, but some promises outlive the people who make them." Her voice cracked at the word promises, and she turned away quickly. "You wouldn't understand." "Then make me," I said, softer this time. She stood, moved to the sink, and rinsed her untouched cup. "When a woman loses herself," she murmured, "she builds new selves to survive. Sometimes those selves need houses. Sometimes they need silence." She set the cup upside down, the water dripping like punctuation. "That's all you need to know." But I couldn't let it go. "And the boy?" I asked. Her hand froze on the edge of the counter. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she said, barely audible, "He's not your father's mistake. He's mine." She turned around, eyes wet but sharp. "Don't look for him. Don't look for any of them. You'll only find what destroyed us once." I wanted to ask more, but she walked away before I could speak. Her steps down the hallway were slow, deliberate, each one closing a door I didn't know existed. And I realized that sometimes the worst things aren't the lies our parents tell us, they're the truths they're too broken to say. After that conversation, something in me changed. I couldn't look at my mother the same way. Every gesture, every word, seemed coded, rehearsed. The air in the house was thick with the kind of silence that only people with shared guilt can breathe. She avoided me, and I let her. But curiosity, once awakened, never goes back to sleep. One night, when she was already in bed, I went into my father's office again. The drawers were cleaner than before, too clean. My mother had been here, tidying, erasing. But she'd missed one thing. In the bottom of the filing cabinet, hidden behind old tax folders, was a small brown envelope labeled simply, "Expenses, Personal." I opened it. Inside were dozens of receipts, all from different places: cafes, pharmacies, motels, grocery stores, scattered across towns I'd never heard him mention. One receipt caught my eye. It was for a toy store purchase. One stuffed rabbit, $18.95. The date was only 4 years ago. My father had been in his late 60s. He had no grandchildren. I set the paper down slowly, my throat tightening. Another receipt, from a diner 2 towns away, had a note scribbled in blue ink: "Lunch with R. Don't forget the gift." The handwriting was unmistakably my father's. I spread the receipts across the desk like puzzle pieces, realizing they painted a picture of a life lived in fragments. A breakfast here, a bouquet there, a tank of gas between 2 worlds. And all of it funded by the same man who taught me that honesty was the only real currency. The irony burned like a secret I hadn't earned but was forced to keep. When I heard footsteps in the hallway, I panicked and swept everything into a drawer. My mother stood in the doorway, wearing her robe, eyes half-shadowed. "You shouldn't go through his things," she said softly. Her tone wasn't angry. It was weary, protective, almost pleading. "They're not his anymore," I said. "They're ours. Or aren't they?" She sighed, walked in, and picked up one of the receipts that had fallen to the floor. Her fingers trembled as she read it. "He tried to keep both worlds afloat," she said, almost to herself. "But no one can live like that forever." Then she looked at me, and for the first time there was no mask, no performance. "I told him once, if he ever chose, I'd forgive him. He never did. And I never did either." She left the room without another word, leaving the receipt in my hand. It was for a small flower shop, the same one near Maple Hill Road. At the bottom, in faint ink, were 3 words written by the cashier: "See you soon, Mrs. C." Mrs. C. My father's last name. The walls of the room seemed to close in, heavy with the weight of a name that no longer belonged only to us. And I understood then. The receipts weren't just proof of what he spent. They were proof of who he was when he wasn't here. Sleep became a stranger after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of that white cottage, the boy's gray-blue eyes, and my mother's trembling hands on the bracelet. The puzzle was complete enough to hurt, but not enough to explain. I kept thinking there had to be one more piece, something hidden in plain sight, waiting for me to look twice. I found it 3 days later, while sorting through an old box of family photos my father had kept in the closet. The pictures were familiar: birthdays, holidays, vacations that blurred together with time. But near the bottom of the stack was one I didn't recognize. My father stood at a park, arm around a woman who wasn't my mother. They weren't posing. They were caught mid-laugh, unaware of the camera. Her auburn hair, the same as the woman from Maple Hill. The back of the photo had a date and 2 words in my father's handwriting: "Ruth, forever grateful." My heart started racing. RG. The initials on the missing heart charm. It wasn't random. It was her. The woman in the photograph, Ruth. And suddenly, everything connected in one unbearable flash. The key, the motel, the hidden receipts, the second house. My mother hadn't just known about her. She'd lived with that knowledge in silence for years. That evening, I placed the photo on the kitchen table and waited. When my mother walked in and saw it, she froze. The cup in her hand nearly slipped. "Where did you get that?" she asked, voice low and sharp. "In his things," I said. "Who is she?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then she sat down, her face pale, as if she'd been waiting for this moment her entire life. "She was part of him," she said finally. "A part one tried to forgive. He met her before you were born. It was supposed to end when we married, but love doesn't always follow vows." Her words cut like glass, not because of what they revealed, but because of how calm she was saying them. "Did he love her?" I asked. She looked down at her bracelet. "He tried not to." I didn't know what to say. The silence between us felt ancient. My mother reached out, touched the photograph gently, and whispered, "She wasn't cruel. She just didn't know how to stop loving him." Then she looked at me, eyes wet but steady. Neither did I. In that moment, I realized she hadn't been living two lives out of selfishness. She'd been surviving inside someone else's unfinished love story. And I couldn't decide which was sadder, the betrayal or the devotion it took to endure it. The next few days passed in uneasy silence. My mother spoke only when necessary, and even then, her words felt measured, as if each one had to pass through a gate of regret before leaving her mouth. I spent hours in my father's office, tracing his handwriting, rereading his notes, hoping one of them would tell me why. But the answers seemed to vanish every time I got close. Then, one afternoon, while flipping through his old ledger, a loose page slipped out. It wasn't a financial note, it was a letter. My father's handwriting again, but not addressed to my mother or me. The paper was worn, the ink smudged, but the name at the top was still clear. To Michael. I stared at it, my pulse hammering. I didn't know a Michael in our family. I read the first line. "My son, if you ever find this, know that I never stopped thinking of you." My hands began to shake. The letter was dated 12 years ago. My father had another son. The words blurred as I kept reading. "Your mother wanted you to have my name, but I thought it best if you didn't. Too much confusion. Too much pain. I send what I can, even if she can't forgive me for leaving." Every sentence was a confession, quiet but devastating. He'd been living two lives, two families, and both of them had called him Dad. When I finished the letter, I sat in the dark for a long time, the paper trembling in my hands. I thought of the boy from Maple Hill, 12 years old, Michael, my half-brother, the son who'd inherited my father's eyes and maybe his silence. That evening, I confronted my mother. I didn't show her the letter at first. I simply asked, "Who is Michael?" The way her face drained of color told me she didn't need to ask how I knew. She sank into a chair, her voice breaking for the first time in weeks. "You weren't supposed to know," she whispered. "Your father wanted to protect you." "Protect me from what?" I asked. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and said, "From loving him less." Her honesty was both cruel and merciful. When I finally showed her the letter, she read it without a word, then folded it carefully and placed it on the table. "He never stopped sending money," she said softly. "Every month. For him. For the woman." She paused, eyes glistening. "And I never stopped letting him." Her confession hit harder than the letter itself. She hadn't been his victim. She'd been his accomplice in silence. I realized then that love doesn't always choose truth. Sometimes it just chooses endurance. The next morning, I couldn't stay in that house another minute. Every object felt contaminated. The photographs, the books, even the walls seemed to echo with whispers I was too tired to hear. I needed air, and more than that, I needed closure. The letter to Michael had unlocked a truth I couldn't unsee, but I still didn't understand why my father had left me the key marked MR. What door was it meant for? I decided to check his bank records. My father had been meticulous with his finances, always balancing his accounts by hand. Among the papers I'd found earlier was a note about a safe deposit box at a local bank. The date of his last visit was just 2 weeks before he died. I called the bank and, after explaining that I was his son, they confirmed he'd indeed rented a box and that I was listed as a secondary access holder. My mother wasn't. When I arrived at the bank, the clerk guided me to a private room. The small metal box was cold to the touch, heavier than I expected. My hands trembled as I turned the key, the one I'd found hidden in his coat. It fit perfectly. For a moment, I hesitated. A part of me still wanted to believe there was some version of the story that ended kindly. But when I opened the box, the truth didn't come out softly. It came out screaming in silence. Inside were 2 envelopes. The first was labeled with my name. The second, in my father's steady handwriting, read for Ruth. My heart sank. I opened mine first. Inside was a single photograph, me as a child, standing between my parents, and a short note. "You are the only thing I did right, even when I did everything else wrong." My throat tightened so much it hurt to breathe. I set it down and opened the other envelope. It contained a check, a large one, made out to Ruth Green, dated just a week before his death, and a letter sealed in wax. Against my better judgment, I broke the seal. The letter began simply, "Ruth, I never meant for our love to live in the shadows. Tell Michael I wanted to see him, but I couldn't destroy what little piece remained." There were no goodbyes, no justifications, only regret, written in ink that had bled at the edges, like tears that had dried too late. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the two letters. One for me, one for her. Two halves of the same man. Two lives, neither complete. When I returned home, I found my mother in the living room, staring out the window as the afternoon light faded. She turned as I entered, eyes already knowing. "You opened it," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I replied. "You knew about it?" She nodded slowly. "He told me once that he couldn't bear to choose. I told him that not choosing was its own kind of cruelty." We didn't speak again that night. She stayed by the window until it was dark, as if waiting for something or someone she knew would never return. And I sat alone in the quiet, holding both letters in my hands, realizing that the safe deposit box hadn't just kept his secrets. It had preserved his unfinished heart. It happened by accident, the kind of accident that changes everything. My mother had gone out for groceries, leaving her purse on the counter. I wasn't snooping, at least, that's what I told myself. But when I reached for my car keys, I noticed another phone tucked inside. Not her usual one, smaller, older, and turned off. My heart stuttered. I pressed the power button. It lit up. There were only a few contacts, no photos, no apps, just numbers saved by initials. R.M.H. The last call had been made 2 weeks before my father's death. I clicked on R and scrolled through the messages. There weren't many, but they were enough. "He's not well. You should come before it's too late." Another, days later. "She knows. Don't call again." I stared at the screen until my hands began to tremble. She knows. My mother. She'd known everything. Maybe even before my father's final days. I placed the phone back where I found it, but my thoughts wouldn't stop racing. What had she meant by "before it's too late"? Too late for what? Forgiveness or exposure? When she came home, I watched her carefully. She looked tired but composed, her lipstick flawless, her silence deliberate. "Did you get everything you needed?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She smiled faintly. "You always ask that," she said. "Maybe you should start asking yourself." She walked away before I could answer, leaving a chill that lingered long after. That night, I turned the phone on again, this time alone in my room. I dialed R, heart pounding. It rang 3 times, then a woman's voice answered, calm, cautious. "Hello." I didn't speak at first. Then I said, "This is Daniel Carter, Henry's son." There was silence, followed by a soft gasp. "You shouldn't be calling me," she said. "It will only make things harder." "Did you love him?" I asked. A long pause. Then, quietly, more than I was allowed to. The line went dead. I sat there in the dark, phone still pressed to my ear, realizing that love, when hidden for too long, doesn't disappear. It just changes form, turns into guilt, silence, or secrets buried so deep they start to rot. And in that moment, I understood that both women, my mother and Ruth, had loved the same man, but neither of them had truly known him. And maybe neither had I. My mother had always said Sundays were her favorite day of the week. "It's the day I give back," she'd tell me, slipping on her beige coat and leaving with a small wicker basket. She said she volunteered at the local church, helping prepare food for the poor. For years, I believed her. I never questioned where she went or why she always returned with the same faint perfume that wasn't hers, a soft floral scent that lingered long after she changed clothes. But now, after everything I'd uncovered, the memory of those Sundays felt different. I couldn't shake the feeling that her volunteering had nothing to do with charity. So one Sunday morning, I followed her. I waited until she left the house, then trailed her car at a safe distance through the winding streets until she turned off the main road and parked near a small park, nowhere near the church. My pulse quickened. She stepped out, holding the same wicker basket, and walked toward a row of benches beneath the trees. I parked across the street, half hidden by the shade of an old oak. A few minutes later, a woman appeared, auburn hair, gray coat. Ruth. They greeted each other with a nod that wasn't friendly but familiar. My mother handed her the basket. Inside, I caught a glimpse of envelopes. Ruth opened it, glanced at the contents, and gave a faint, sad smile. They talked for a long time. I couldn't hear what they said, but I could see the tension in their movements, my mother's stiff posture, Ruth's trembling hands. When they finally stood, my mother reached out as if to touch her arm, but Ruth stepped back. My mother froze, nodded once, and walked away. Ruth stayed seated for a few minutes after, staring at the basket like it was a wound that wouldn't heal. I waited until my mother's car disappeared down the road before approaching. Ruth looked up when she saw me, her expression shifting from surprise to resignation. "I thought this might happen one day," she said quietly. "You have his eyes." She opened the basket, revealing a single envelope, the last payment I realized. "She always made sure you never knew," Ruth said. "She thought she was protecting you. Maybe she was." I wanted to be angry, to demand answers, but her voice was so gentle it disarmed me. "Why meet here?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "Because every Sunday, we both pretended we were better women than we really were." She stood, handed me the envelope, and whispered, "You deserve to know sooner." Then she walked away, leaving behind the faint scent of lavender, the same perfume that used to linger on my mother's coat. When I opened the envelope later that night, it wasn't money inside. It was a photograph of my parents and Ruth, all three of them, smiling, young and unbroken. A week later, my mother insisted on baking a cake. She said she needed something normal, something to remind her that life still went on. I didn't argue. The house smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, like the days before all this began, when happiness still fit between us. She hummed softly while stirring the batter, a song I didn't recognize. It wasn't one of hers, and I realized she'd picked it up from someone else's life. After dinner, she brought out the cake. Chocolate frosting, 3 candles. "For what occasion?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "It's your father's birthday." But I knew his birthday was in May, and it was October. I didn't correct her. She lit the candles, hands trembling slightly, and said, "He always loved this kind of cake." I watched her stare at the flames as if waiting for them to answer something. After she went to bed, I cleaned up the table. When I threw the cake box away, I noticed a small receipt inside. The date printed on it matched that day, but the name written on the order for line wasn't ours. It read, "Michael Carter." My chest tightened. My father's second son, my half-brother, shared not only his blood, but his name. My mother hadn't baked for my father at all. She'd baked for him. The next morning, I confronted her. "You ordered the cake under his name," I said. She froze for a second, then exhaled slowly. "Old habits," she murmured. "I used to order things for him, back when your father couldn't." Her eyes grew distant, as if she were looking through time. "I sent gifts on birthdays, pretending they were from his father. He couldn't always be there, but I couldn't let the boy think he wasn't loved." I didn't know what to say. For years, I'd seen her as the betrayed one, but she'd been part of the lie, shaping it, nurturing it, keeping it alive. "Why?" I asked finally. Her voice broke when she answered, "Because I thought loving him that way would hurt less than hating him." That night, I sat in the dark kitchen, the scent of chocolate still lingering. The house was quiet, but my thoughts weren't. I imagined a boy somewhere, blowing out 3 candles, thinking his father had remembered him. And I wondered which was sadder, the truth that he hadn't, or the love of a woman who couldn't stop pretending he had. A few days later, the mail arrived, a small pile of envelopes, most of them bills and condolences that had come too late. My mother wasn't home. She'd gone to visit a friend, Or at least that's what she said. I sifted through the letters absent-mindedly until one caught my eye. It had no return address, only our house number written in my mother's handwriting. But the name on it wasn't hers, it was to M. My first thought was Michael. I felt my stomach tighten. I turned the envelope over in my hands. It was sealed with clear tape, not the usual lick and stick kind, as if meant to hide its contents from moisture or from guilt. Against every reasonable impulse, I opened it. Inside was a folded sheet of lined paper, worn at the edges from being read too many times. "My dear M," it began. "If you're reading this, it means I've failed at keeping my promise. I wanted to stay invisible in your story, but maybe every child deserves to know the shape of their shadow." I stopped breathing. The handwriting was unmistakably my mother's. She wrote about my father, about how he had loved Michael's mother long before he ever met her. She confessed that when she found out about the child, she wanted to leave, but couldn't. I told myself that if I stayed, I could fix what was broken. But some cracks aren't meant to be mended. They're meant to remind us what we lost. Halfway down the page, the tone changed. "I sent you gifts every year. I baked cakes I pretended were for him, but they were for you. I don't know if you ever received them, or if Ruth threw them away. Maybe that's better. You shouldn't carry my guilt." My hands trembled as I reached the last lines. "If one day my son, your brother, comes looking for the truth, tell him I'm sorry for loving you in silence. Tell him I loved him in silence, too." I sat there at the table for a long time, staring at her words. They weren't the confessions of a guilty woman. They were the whispers of someone who had been loving from the shadows, trying to repair what life had refused to make right. When my mother returned that evening, I didn't mention the letter. I simply looked at her differently, not as the keeper of lies, but as someone who had carried too much truth alone. And for the first time, I understood. She hadn't lived a double life out of betrayal. She'd lived it because her heart had never fit inside just one. A week later, I received a call from the lawyer handling my father's estate. He said there was one last matter to settle, a property listed under my father's name, but not included in the official will. The address sounded unfamiliar. Riverside Lane, apartment 3B. I knew instantly it had to be connected to Ruth. Something in me resisted going, but another part, the part that had already crossed every forbidden line, needed to see it. The apartment was near the edge of town, in an old brick building overlooking the river. The sun was setting when I arrived, and the reflection on the water made everything shimmer in gold and sorrow. The key, my father's key, fit perfectly into the lock. I turned it slowly, the sound echoing like a memory that had been waiting to be heard. Inside, the air was stale but familiar. The furniture was modest, a brown sofa, a wooden dining table, and framed photographs on the walls. I walked closer. In every photo, my father was there, smiling, laughing, alive. In one, he was holding a baby, Michael. In another, he stood between Ruth and the boy at what looked like a school fair, pride softening the lines of his face. It was a life he had lived in parallel to mine, a reality that existed just across the river. On the table lay an open journal. I hesitated before touching it, but curiosity won. The first page began with Ruth's handwriting. He said he couldn't live two lives anymore. I told him he already had, one with her, one with us. The question was, which one did he want to die in? My chest tightened. I turned the pages slowly, each one painting a picture of quiet devotion and endless waiting. Then, near the end, there was a short entry dated 2 days before he died. He says he's going to tell her the truth this time. I told him it's too late, but I think he already knows that. I closed the journal, my heart heavy. The river outside glimmered under the last light of day, moving slow and indifferent. I walked to the window and looked out. From there, I could see the outline of our neighborhood across the water. My house, my street, my past. We'd been living so close, divided only by a stretch of river and a web of silence. Before leaving, I noticed a small wooden box on the nightstand. Inside was a bracelet identical to my mother's, but newer, with 3 charms still intact, H, R, and a tiny silver heart. I held it for a moment, then put it back where I found it. Some truths I realized don't need to be carried twice. When I locked the door behind me, the river sounded louder, as if it were trying to wash away everything I'd seen. But some things, some loves, don't fade with water. They stain. For weeks, I tried to make peace with what I'd found, but peace refused to come. The image of that apartment haunted me, the laughter frozen in photographs, the smell of dust clinging to a life I was never meant to witness. Every time I thought I could forgive my father, a new piece of his silence rose from the shadows to remind me how much he'd hidden. One night, unable to sleep, I went back to his office. It felt different now, smaller, colder, like a stage after the actors have left. His old leather chair still creaked when I sat down. The desk still carried the faint smell of tobacco and ink. I opened his ledger again, not looking for numbers this time, but for meaning. Between the pages, I found a small folded card tucked inside a blank envelope. My name was written on it, in his familiar, steady hand. It wasn't a letter, just a few lines. If silence hurts you, it's because you've been taught to listen for answers outside yourself. I stayed quiet because I didn't know which truth would break you less. I stared at those words until they blurred into tears. My father had carried guilt, not arrogance. His silence hadn't been cowardice, it had been mercy, however misguided. But mercy can wound as deeply as deceit. I thought of my mother, sitting by the window night after night, holding her coffee like a ritual. I thought of Ruth, raising a boy on half a promise. And I thought of myself, the collateral of a love that refused to fit inside one home. I folded the card back into the envelope and placed it in my pocket. For the first time, I didn't feel angry, just tired. My father had spoken more through his quiet than through all the words he never said. And maybe that was the cruelest part, that the truth he feared would destroy us had already done so in his absence. That night, as the rain began tapping against the window, I whispered into the empty room, "I would have forgiven you." My voice cracked halfway through. The sound of the rain swallowed it whole. And in that moment, I understood. Sometimes, silence isn't the absence of love. It's the echo of it, trapped in someone who never learned how to speak it aloud. It was a Thursday evening when my mother called me down for dinner. Her voice sounded calm, almost rehearsed. I hesitated before going. Part of me dreaded the silence that always hung between us now. But when I entered the kitchen, the table was already set for two. Candles flickered softly, and the smell of roasted chicken filled the air. It was the same meal my father used to love. She poured wine into 2 glasses, then sat across from me. For a while, neither of us spoke. The clinking of cutlery was the only sound, steady and fragile. Finally, she said, "I went to see her today." I froze. "Ruth?" I asked. She nodded, taking a slow sip of wine. We talked for a long time. She wanted to hate me. I think I wanted to hate her too. But we were both just tired. I didn't know what to say. "Why tell me now?" I asked. She looked up, her eyes catching the candlelight. "Because it's time you stop seeing me as the victim." I stayed because I chose to. I forgave him long before I should have. And every time I baked, every time I smiled through it, I was feeding the ghost of a man who didn't know how to stay whole. Her words were sharp, but not bitter. There was a strange peace in her tone, the kind that comes only when the storm has already passed. "She showed me the bracelet," she said. "The one like mine. He gave it to her before he gave me mine. Did you know that?" I shook my head. He told her it was to remind her that love can exist in 2 forms, one chosen, one denied. She laughed quietly. And yet, neither of us ever really had him. We ate in silence for a while. Then she reached into her pocket and placed something on the table, the missing heart charm. It glimmered faintly in the candlelight. "I buried the other one in the garden," she said softly. "But this one belongs to you. You're the only thing we both loved without pretending." I stared at the charm for a long time before picking it up. It felt warm, almost alive. "What happens now?" I asked. She smiled sadly. "Now, we stop looking backward." But even as she said it, I knew that the past doesn't stop when we turn away from it. It lingers, waiting to be remembered. And as we sat there, mother and son, eating the meal of a man who had loved two women in one lifetime, I realized that the truth wasn't something we discovered. It was something we finally learned to sit beside. It was Ruth who called me first. Her voice trembled, soft and uncertain, as if she'd rehearsed the words for years. "He knows about you," she said quietly. "Michael." I told him the truth. I felt my heart skip a beat. I'd imagined this moment 100 times, meeting the boy who carried half of my father's blood, but now that it was real, I felt more fear than curiosity. We agreed to meet at a cafe by the river. When I arrived, Ruth was already there, sitting by the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. Beside her sat a young man, tall, calm, his hair the same color as my father's when he was young. He looked up as I approached. Our eyes met, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Those gray-blue eyes, the same ones that haunted me since the funeral. "Michael," Ruth said softly, "this is your brother." He nodded politely, unsure whether to smile or frown. "I've seen pictures of you," he said. His voice was steady, older than his years. He kept them in the drawer by his bed. The words hit me harder than I expected. My father had never kept photos of me there. "He told me once that you were the better man," Michael continued. I didn't understand what he meant until now. We talked for hours. About our childhoods, our mothers, the stories we'd been told, and the lies we'd both inherited. He spoke with quiet resentment, not toward me, but toward the father we never really had. "He promised to come to my graduation," Michael said. "He never did. Now I know why." I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, but the truth was, it wasn't just his disappointment to carry. It was mine too. At one point, he pulled something from his pocket, a small bracelet charm shaped like a heart, cracked in the middle. "Mom said it was part of something yours," he said. "Maybe we were meant to share it." I held it in my palm beside mine. Two halves, same design, broken differently. For a moment, it felt like the universe was giving us a symbol too perfect to be coincidence. When we parted, we didn't hug. We didn't need to. There was something sacred in the silence that followed, a kind of mutual recognition, the quiet understanding that we were both fragments of the same unfinished story. As I watched him walk away with Ruth, I realized something my father never could. You can't live two lives without leaving one of them orphaned. And though he left us both behind, he gave us something he never managed to find, the chance to see ourselves in each other and forgive him through that reflection. That night, after meeting Michael, I went home to find my mother sitting in her usual place, by the window, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. She didn't ask where I'd been. She didn't need to. Mothers have a way of sensing when the air around their children changes. She looked at me quietly for a long time, then said, "You met him?" I nodded. "He looks like Dad." Her eyes softened, though her lips stayed still. "I know," she whispered. "Sometimes I used to imagine that boy's face when your father came home late. I used to picture what he looked like, not out of hate, but because I wanted to understand what kind of love could make a man live two lives." Her words hung in the air, heavy but calm. "And did you understand?" I asked. She took a long breath, her gaze drifting toward the darkened street. "Eventually," she said. "Love doesn't always split itself evenly. Sometimes it multiplies, and in the process, it breaks the vessel that holds it." She turned to me then, her voice trembling but certain. "I stayed because I wanted to believe I could make him whole again. I thought if I was patient enough, if I forgave enough, the part of him that belonged to her would fade. But that's not how it works. People don't unlove. They just learn to carry it differently." I sat beside her, the night silent except for the faint ticking of the clock. "Did you ever love him after you knew?" I asked. She smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "More than before," she said. "Because after I knew, I finally saw him for who he really was, flawed, afraid, human. And loving someone after that is the truest kind of love there is." For the first time, I saw my mother not as a victim of my father's double life, but as a participant in the same impossible equation. She hadn't lived in his shadow. She'd chosen to stay inside the storm, to hold on to what little warmth she could find. And maybe, in her own way, she'd been as brave as she was broken. As she stood to go to bed, she paused at the doorway. "Don't let this story make you bitter," she said softly. "Let it make you honest." Then she left me there, surrounded by the ghosts of two lives that had somehow made one. The next morning, I woke to the sound of drawers opening and closing. My mother was in my father's office again. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, soft and pale, dust floating in slow motion around her silhouette. She wasn't searching this time. She was sorting, organizing, letting go. "I think it's time," she said when she noticed me standing by the door. "Your father never wanted us to live in a museum." I stepped closer and saw the pile she'd made: papers, books, photos, old watches. Each object was a fragment of him, a quiet witness to everything he'd been. "What do we keep?" I asked. She smiled faintly. "Only what doesn't lie." She handed me a small wooden box, the one I'd found empty weeks ago, where my father had hidden the key. But now it wasn't empty. Inside lay a sealed envelope, yellowed at the corners. On it, in his handwriting, were 3 words: "For both of you." We sat together on the floor as I opened it. Inside was a letter, his last one, written, it seemed, on the night before he died. "If you're reading this," it began, "then the truth has already done what I never could: bring you together." My mother's breath hitched. "I never wanted either of you to carry the weight of my choices," he continued. "You were both my home, even when I couldn't live in one. The world taught me that love must choose sides, but I never learned how. So I spent my life protecting what little good I could, you." Tears welled in my mother's eyes, silent but heavy. She pressed her hand to her mouth as if trying to keep years of pain from spilling out. The letter ended simply: "If love failed me, it's because I tried to keep it instead of letting it live. Forgive me by doing what I couldn't: be whole." We sat in silence for a long time after that. There was no anger left, no blame, only the strange comfort that comes when truth finally stops hiding. My mother folded the letter carefully, kissed it once, and placed it back in the box. "He was always protecting us," she whispered, "even from himself." Later that evening, as the sun disappeared behind the river, I walked out into the garden. The soil where she had once buried the broken charm was soft again, almost inviting. I knelt down and buried the letter beside it. It felt right, as if the earth, not us, should hold the final piece of his story. And when I looked up, I could swear the wind that moved through the hydrangeas carried his voice, not words, just warmth. The day we buried my father's letter was the first time the house felt quiet, not empty, but peaceful. For months, silence had been heavy, a constant reminder of everything unsaid. But now, it felt softer, like the pause between heartbeats. My mother stood beside me in the garden, her hands folded in front of her. "He would have liked this," she murmured. "No speeches. No goodbyes. Just rest." That weekend, we visited the cemetery. She brought 2 bouquets, one of lilies for my father and one of small white daisies. I didn't ask who the second was for. She placed the lilies on his grave, then walked a few rows down and knelt beside another headstone. From where I stood, I could just make out the name Ruth Green. My chest tightened. My mother touched the stone gently, then whispered something I couldn't hear. When she stood, her face was calm, almost radiant in its exhaustion. "We both lost the same man," she said. "It's time he finally belongs to no one." I nodded, understanding more in that moment than words could hold. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't come from finding answers. It comes from realizing there's nothing left to fight over. As we walked back toward the car, I glanced behind us, 2 graves side by side, divided only by a narrow strip of earth. I thought of the river, of the 2 houses facing each other from opposite shores, and how love had tried to live in both. Maybe this was how it was always meant to end: 2 lives, 2 loves, finally resting in the same silence. That evening, I found my mother in the garden again, the air thick with the scent of rain. She was holding both bracelets, hers and Ruth's, the charms now reunited. "What will you do with them?" I asked. She smiled faintly. Bury them here. Let the earth decide what stays. She pressed the bracelets into the soil and whispered, for all that was real. As the first drops of rain began to fall, I realized something my father had tried his whole life to understand, that love doesn't need to be perfect to be true. It just needs to be seen even when it breaks us. And as I stood beside my mother, watching the rain blur the world into one soft reflection, I finally felt it. Forgiveness, quiet and complete. Not for him, but for all of us who loved him anyway.